welcome to INET's webinar, Trillions in COVID-19 Bailouts, Where Did It Go? I am Pia Malani, Senior Economist here at INET. Today we are pleased to welcome Jesse Eisinger, Senior Reporter and Editor at ProPublica, and author of the book, The Chickenshit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. Jesse won a Pulitzer for his work on Wall Street's questionable moral practices, and has, for the last few months, been bringing his keen reporting skills to understanding how and for whom the bailout has been working. Jesse will be talking today with INET's president, Rob Johnson. They're going to speak for about 40 minutes, and we'll take some questions after the discussion. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A button where you can type your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. So with that, let me hand it over to Rob and Jesse. If you can both unmute. Sorry, Rob, if you could unmute.
Mute. Okay, now unmuted. I want to thank you, Jesse, for joining us. This is a very important theme that you're pursuing. I've often said that the key to excellent analysis, 90% of the key is to choose the right questions. And while people are scurrying around in the distress and the chaos that's related to the fallout from the pandemic, I observed you to be digging deeper. Your papers at ProPublica, the bailout is working for the rich, and this Treasury official is running the bailout, and it's great for his family. Compliment the power of the work that you did in the Chickenshit Club, as well as your extraordinary Pulitzer Prize winning work at ProPublica. This question, as what you might call the anxiety, the acute anxiety of the onset, how you say, moves into the distance behind us. These distributional questions and the legitimacy of governance that the people of the United States feel will become central to what we have faith in and how we construct our society going forward. So I would like to turn it over to you, and please, we can interact back and forth. But you're the star of the show today, and I'm interested in these people hearing your voice, which has so profoundly affected me.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Rob, for that, and thank you, Pia, and thanks to INET for bringing me onto the webinar. I really appreciate it. I'm a reporter and editor at ProPublica, and so I'm editing our bailout coverage, and we are seeking to hold the powerful accountable, as we do at ProPublica, and raise questions about how the bailout is working, who it's working for, and what the consequences of the bailout will be into the future. And I'm glad that you raised the story about the Treasury official, Justin Muzinich, who is really running the bailout effectively. He's Steve Mnuchin's right-hand man, because that was an investigative coup by my reporters, Justin Elliott, Lydia DePillis, Robert Federecci, and Paul Keel, who work for me, and I'm editing their story. But that was really an extraordinary piece of reporting about how Muzinich himself has engaged in something of a fake disclosure of his family's bond buying business and is benefiting from the bailout himself. We can get into the details there. But largely, I have been struck by two things, and they're kind of related to each other, Rob. And what I want to kind of talk about today is that this bailout has some very different contours than the bailout from 2008. Of course, it has a completely different cause, an unforeseen pandemic. Now, pandemics, of course, are not unforeseen, but this specific one was unforeseen. And the scale has been much greater than anything that we've seen in our lifetime. That's obviously the case. But there are similarities, and there's certainly similarities to the two bailouts in 2009 and this year. And unfortunately, in my view, the similarities are that we're replicating a lot of the mistakes. And the very simple way to think about this is we are privileging capital over labor. We are bailing out investors first and bailing out average workers second and inadequately, which leads me to the other main point of this, besides that we're replicating mistakes of 2008, is that what are the problems and what have we seen from the bailout so far? And I think what we've seen is one very broad thing, which is that the wealthy are being helped and average Americans are receiving significantly less help. Now, I don't want to minimize the many billions of dollars that have gone to expand unemployment insurance and the stimulus checks. That was an extraordinary effort, the biggest effort in certainly in my lifetime, bigger than the 2008 bailout by not just dollar figures, but by I think portion of GDP as well. But it is completely different from the effort that the Federal Reserve and is doing, which disproportionately helps the wealthy by helping asset holders. And there are four ways. One is speed. Another is conditions. The third is question of limits. And then the fourth is its permanence or time delineation. And we can get into all of these, but there are really stark differences between the way the wealthy are being helped and the poor. And I think or average Americans, not just low-income Americans, but average Americans, including low-income. And I think it's very important to focus on that and understand it.
Gotta unmute. Well, Jesse, I'm very interested in one dimension, which is the pandemic itself requires a change in behavior, lockdown, people staying home, etc. And as people in the lower reaches of income and wealth become scared, they're tempted to take more risk with their own life by going back to work, and therefore contributing to the propagation and the, what you might call, the depth and duration of the pandemic. Should these bailouts have been structured differently to extinguish the, what you might call, necessity of people remaining publicly engaged in those lower rungs? Would that have brought the crisis to an end sooner than what we're doing?
Well, this is a little bit out of my depth. Of course, it's a question one for epidemiologists, and I'm not an epidemiologist. Two, I've been much more focused and would be on firmer ground talking about the Federal Reserve and the bailout of asset holders. But I think what's important, and this is not my original observation, many people have made this observation, but I think it's very important, is that we have seen a relatively successful bailout happening for average working citizens, and that's in Europe. And it seems quite clear that a much better way to have done this would have been to underwrite payrolls in some way, ensure people's salaries and income. And that would have avoided an enormous number of moral hazard problems, which are kind of lesser concern than the actual direct bailout, because we want to bail out in a terrible fire. You want to, and then you worry about moral hazard as a secondary concern. It's not an insignificant concern, but it is a secondary concern. And we would have also really avoided this kind of disproportionate benefit to the wealthy and to asset holders with no conditions on it. So I think that we had a clear policy. We have a mechanism for understanding what people's payrolls are through the IRS, through tax forms and other ways, and we could have gotten that money to average Americans. It sort of brings me to one main point that we have here, which is that Congress and the Fed have both acted. And I do blame Congress primarily and not the Fed for what it's doing, although I think the Fed could be doing a more thoughtful and better job here. But the way we have helped working Americans was very slow. And the way the Fed worked was instantaneous. We have mechanisms in our society that can channel money to asset holders instantaneously, literally overnight and less than overnight. And our mechanisms for getting money, bailout money, aid to average Americans takes time, days and weeks to mail checks. And in fact, for low-income Americans, many low-income Americans are not going to get stimulus checks. My reporters Paul Keel and Justin Elliott wrote a story now a couple months ago about how low-income people are not going to get stimulus checks for a variety of reasons. Some insane, discouraging, frustrating, appalling systems where low-income people, when they go to get tax prep from companies like TurboTax, which is owned by Intuit, they actually get signed up for a third-party bank. A third-party bank opens up an account for them. And this is just to channel the fee from the tax prep. Now, as a side note, these low-income people probably shouldn't have to pay for, they don't have to pay for tax prep because there's a law and the IRS has a program to give tax prep to the vast majority of Americans for free. And Paul and Justin have done fabulous reporting about how the tax prep companies undermine that IRS program for literally decades. So they set up this third-party account. It's a one-time account that just channels the fee to the companies. And the IRS sent the checks to this third-party bank. And so people couldn't get access to it. And sometimes the third-party bank sent it back to the IRS. Terrible onerous delays for the people that really needed the stimulus the most quickly. So we have a broken system in this way, and that has really turned out to be disadvantageous, not surprisingly, to the weakest and most vulnerable among us.
You mentioned the four conditions, and you've discussed speed, but the question of limits and conditions pertaining to what these people who get the fast and big money are restricted to do or not to do. Can you illuminate a little bit about what's missing that you think should be there in that dimension of the bailout?
Yes, well, it actually is outlined in Congress. Congress